in this forum, or it may be that you know of something which you think ought to be on the table. I mean, that John has made a claim here, in a sense. This is the best that is available. But I think we ought to check that, and, you know, are there other things which ought also to be on the table? So those were the 2 points that I'd like you to reflect on, in order to give you a chance to do that, I'm just going to take 1 or 2 issues out of the presentations we've just heard, which I think we should take up a little bit later on in the discussion, because there are some wider issues there. I think you know, a lot of emphasis was placed this morning on having numbers, and again this afternoon, and clearly that's really important in terms of convincing policymakers. But what role does having people's voices play in this? I mean, we've had a very powerful example where local policy is apparently in the process of being adjusted. So, and that relates back to the bundle of methods that we bring to these issues. We've heard about the importance of identifying the right interlocutor in policy terms, and I think that's something to bring back to the table this afternoon. The Ministry of Finance rather than the Ministry of Tourism in Ethiopia. Is that actually a common phenomenon if you're trying to change policy? Perhaps it isn't the tourism, within the tourism sector, that the impulse for change will come from. I think we've also had some very interesting illustrations of the importance of context, and I wonder how we're going to deal with that in this sort of benchmarking exercise and so on. I mean, clearly there's some contexts that you can compare and you can learn across from one to the other, but there are other contexts which, you know, are too far away for that. And how do we address that? I think there are destinations at very different stages and countries at very different stages. So I think that's an important issue to carry forwards. The issue of criteria that Kate raised in her presentation, no clear criteria. Is that really the case? Can we really not do a little bit better than that with all this wealth of work on the ground, or at least on the table? If it is the case, then it seems to me that that's a really serious issue. But perhaps that links through to the way that the tourism discourse relates to the broader development discourse. Can the broader development discourse not provide some answers to that kind of question? Okay, those were my points, but those are in a sense to carry forwards to the discussion later this afternoon, and that was really just to give you time to search your mind for any other examples of how to get increased impact. I don't know whether we should go by categories, because I'm aware that some people talk a lot at these sorts of events, and other people don't talk a lot, and I suspect that the academics probably do the most talking, so I think we'll come to them last. I'd like to encourage people who work for companies, particularly, to bring up some examples from their experience to start with.
Don't work for companies.
All right.
My name is Claudia Townsend and I'm a consultant in fact. But I did want to say something about the private sector, so vaguely relevant to people who do work for companies. And you mentioned impulse for change. And my experience has been in some places, notably Madagascar, where there isn't a lot of research going on, or necessarily the impulse from government, that the private sector are the people that are bringing this onto the agenda and bringing change into, starting to make change happen, rather than government, NGOs, or community tourism people. They're responding to market demand largely, and they are making the economic case from a non-research based perspective, but in a more practical way for the economic value of more pro-poor and sustainable tourism. That's my point.
Hi, Xavier Fon, International Centre for Responsible Tourism. Two very brief points. One is that if any of the people on the table are interested in a study that might be helpful but happens to be in Spanish, studied on supply chain management and action planning with hoteliers in Colombia, then that would be quite useful. Very different kind of economical situation with much stronger local supply chains. The study I did for the World Tourism Organization last year, and what WTO is interested in now is, after the action planning workshop and a few months after that, to find out how many of the actions that the hoteliers themselves committed to doing in that workshop in writing will actually have happened. Which leads me to a point I wanted to make them to Kate, in that trying to link cause and consequence, and how monitoring and evaluation is probably very good at capturing a picture of the situation at the time. But if we then try to bring in some policy interventions and measure against that baseline afterwards, how do we isolate the impact that individual policy intervention will have made as opposed to other structural or other influences that will have happened? The problem I come across in my work, and I imagine that when we try to explain those figures, a lot of time should be spent on looking at why those figures look the way they do, and it'll be tempting to just take them at face value.
Of course, attribution is an enormous problem in evaluating interventions, sort of well known in the evaluation world. And I suppose the usual responses to that are you need to end up with a plausible argument, and you need to triangulate, you need to have different sources, but it's an expensive and time-consuming business. Yeah.
Yes, Richard Denman from the tourism company, we're again consultants, but I'd very much like to back up what has just been said about the private sector. I've done a small amount of work in Ethiopia, as Sean knows, and to say, really very encouraged by the line that the World Bank is taking, and I'm sure he's absolutely right in the fact that he was sort of concentrating on getting the finance minister on board on this, and clearly that's hugely important. But from the sort of level where I've been working sort of very much at the ground level, if you like, I've been really quite encouraged by the response of some of the private sector operators in Ethiopia, and particularly the local incoming handling agents and so on, who seem to be really very positive about trying to do something in this area, and a lot of, well, some of them are making some investments and so on. I do think it's very important that the links are made between the private sector and government, so that they should be very much round the table as things move forward there in Ethiopia. I mean, I'm sure the World Bank is planning for that to happen, but looking at it from the practical work that I've been doing on the ground, I can see a lot of private sector potential response, but they need the context, and they need to be around the table with government and saying the sort of right things to government at this stage, I think, as well. So I back up that previous comment about the private sector engagement.
Can I just ask both of you who commented there? I mean, you used the word response, and I think you probably used the word initiative, and you indicated that the private sector would be taking initiative. The word response suggests that they're responding to something or some other impulse. I mean, is that the right difference in those two contexts?
I mean, as far as the private sector is concerned, response is very often, and rightly so, about responding to a market opportunity. But I think there's also very much a response to the sort of social impact, not so necessarily directly poverty alleviation per se, but a feeling that they want to be doing something which is right for the long-term environment for tourism to flourish in the country, and that does very much involve relationships with local communities and addressing poverty alleviation, although they wouldn't necessarily analyse it quite like that, I think. Yes, front row.
Klaus Lengerfeld, not from the private sector, but working mainly with the private sector. I can give you some very concrete examples of good practices. I don't know why you didn't cite it, because it's in your paper as well. The Sandals case, Sandals in Jamaica, they have their own agricultural extension officer. They give seed to farmers. They work with the public agricultural extension agency together to make farmers eligible for the 12 hotels. And this means for 5 farmer cooperatives an annual business of $3.3 million US. And it was very low some 10 years ago. So this is a concrete example, but what you need to do to achieve this, to sit together with the hotel operators and find out what is their needs, and how poor people can become eligible for that. I think that's perfectly possible in Siem Reap, for example. We have some of the major brands of hotels, the luxury hotels, good hotels, sit together with them and try to find out what are both linkages to supply chains and also recruitment. What must you do with poor people to make them eligible for the jobs? And one consequence that we have taken, as GT said, the best moment to start making tourism more pro-poor is when it starts getting planned. So we are looking now into something like sustainable or responsible hotel development and investment and destination development, because the hotel operators usually come in half a year before the hotel opens. Then it's too late to make farmers eligible. It's too late to make poor people eligible for the jobs. So this is the whole investment process you have to relate with in order to make this tourism development really very much pro-poor. And my experience with the hotel operators, they are not easily accessible, but they are interested in these issues, and we have a lot of interesting cooperations with hotel companies, also some who are active in Siem Reap on these issues. And I want to raise one one issue that has not been mentioned so far, but that's maybe in terms of the money that can go to poor people, it's the most challenging issue. It's the issue of the land value explosion where tourism comes in. 100 kilometers of coast of Nicaragua was, as a cattle land, was worth less than $1 a square meter. Now you have major investments there, and they pay $40. So if you take only from this 100 kilometers, not all of the coast, half of it, of the land 1 kilometer inside, the added value from the tourism value explosion is $2 billion. In this moment, 95% to more of this goes to the rich people in the country, the politicians who have managed to speculate on the land, together with the real estate companies. I dare to take them, to call them sharks from California, who are in that business. They come, they sit down with a poor farmer, and he signs selling his land. He feels, oh, I made 50% more than I would have made if I would have sold it locally. Doesn't see that 2,000% much more is what they earn. One example: if you only give half of that land as a leasehold and take 5% of the value leasehold, you have $50 million a year income for either the poor communities or the former owners if they keep being owners of the land. I've seen no donor, not in any place of the world, who has any work done on this issue, unfortunately. And it's an issue in Mozambique, in Madagascar, in Cape Verde. I feel in Siem Reap the land value also. So there are some missing links still, where from the very beginning you can exploit what is the value added of tourism, and maybe this 50 million case shows you to get this through supply chains later is much more difficult. So there are some really concrete points to tackle, and I think we should not do more research, but do research that brings us to such projects that really exploit these benefits. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really important point about this land, I think, and land tenure reform, which is of course on the agenda in many countries, but I think this dimension doesn't often figure very much.
Hi, I'm Jane Ashton from First Choice Holidays PLC, so a real life company. Lots of what's been said today rings very true with us. I mean, we've got a clear business interest to understand the socio-economic impacts of our business and how we can maximise the benefits of our business. And we too have experienced a dearth of research in that area. Where we have got clear evidence, though, is that our employees are interested in this, our customers are interested in this, increasingly the city's interested in this. Lots been said about not having robust research and the frustrations of trying to influence the right policymakers. So I'd be interested to know where working together with the private sector fits in with your plans, because I think the private sector are ripe for joint initiatives in this area.
That's a good question, and I think it would be good for the panel when we come back to reflect on that. Any more contributions from companies yet?
Consultancy, I'm afraid.
Companies and consultants. We'll broaden it to NGOs and finally academics.
Yeah. This business works at so many levels, and just thinking about our range of discussions and the public sector and government, it's very important, obviously, to work on governments in these countries and to try and get them on side. We've heard about the restrictions that public sector policy can impose, and I'm not sure. We've heard about some very good research that's been done, but all of us tend to kind of parachute into these countries, and how much our impacts are there, or how much the impact is on governments in those places is obviously questionable, because the governments themselves quickly changed and so forth, and there's not much continuity. But there is an example, I think, from my previous consultancy, my old boss in the housing sector. He was hired by the ADB to go to Sri Lanka for quite a period, about 18 months. It was ushering in a new bank for providing loans to poor people. It was rather specific and not tourism, but I think that the very fact that he was there and able to shepherd this through over a prolonged period of time was very important. And I don't know what ODI and DFID's policies is in terms of implanting people for longer term periods, but I think that's really critical. And then just another quick few words on Siem Reap, where a lot of us seem to have worked there. Obviously, the focus we're having this afternoon on private sector is very important, but quite a few major programs have to be done at public sector level. I personally worked on the sewerage infrastructure scheme there. Clearly that has to be done in the public sector, so it's a big project. But the useful thing to it was a fairly hard-nosed exercise to check the affordability of the scheme. But the thing that made the difference was the tourism income from through sort of bed tax, effectively. Did make it feasible, whereas previously it wouldn't have been. And I was myself quite surprised at how important that was. So, just a general thought. Thank you.
Liz Drake, I'm from the industry. I've had about 30 years experience of actually operating from a private company, but I'm also an advisor, technical tourism advisor. And I would say definitely that tourism can benefit the poor, but it's a question of how you can influence the level of benefit. And I think you ought to consider a few things that perhaps haven't been looked at too seriously so far. It's an international industry, so even though you're looking at specific destinations, it sits within a global picture. And it's quite important to understand how people make choices and how they perceive a destination and what they will expect from it. In terms of the private businesses operating within a destination and how they can influence the amount of benefit going to the poor, there are new considerations. It's not only one of the fastest growing industries in the world, it's one of the fastest evolving industries in the world, so nothing is static. So a survey that is done last year could be completely different in 2 years' time because the market perceives that destination differently. Also, the legislation that the private companies have to comply with now is forever changing and increasing. So when you're looking at shopping, okay, that doesn't affect the private company, except if they're recommending something, they have to be careful what they're recommending. In terms of excursions and local transport, health and safety issues now are a serious matter to be considered. Corporate culpability is big on the agenda, almost bigger than corporate social responsibility. And I think when you're looking at the practical implications of your research, these factors ought to be looked at as well, because if those aren't considered, nothing will actually be implemented.
Anybody else from the companies and consultants before we open the floor a bit wider? Companies and consultants.
I want to speak on behalf of the company because Jane didn't actually bring it up, but I wanted to refer to the work that Adma Barr's doing with the visits to the agricultural linkages project which he has going in the Gambia. And a number of tour operators in the UK have contributed to that, first choice not least amongst them, precisely because of the point that you were making about the importance of overcoming the problems around the EU Package Travel Directive. And I think that's maybe one of the issues we should be taking up. If we're serious about poverty benefit from tourism, we ought to be looking again at the EU Package Travel Directive and suggesting that the EU gets its policy joined up rather than discriminate against poor producers.
Thank you very much. That's a useful point, and let's come back to that this afternoon as a potential focus. Yes.
I'm
I'm Sue Hurdle from the Travel Foundation, and we work with companies, including First Choice and others, to help companies get to grips with what sustainable tourism is about and help to apply it in a very practical sense. And without sort of echoing too much what I'm going to say later on, I just wanted to reiterate the point that Harold made there about the Gambia. You know, there are a lot of companies that are interested in this, and one of the ways in which they can get involved is by providing expertise to help overcome those health and safety issues. So where there is an excursion, through providing volunteers to help with a program which has actually happened in the Gambia, then the legislation can be got round. And I suppose the point about this morning has been that there's lots and lots of analysis going on in different pockets of the world, and the private sector is obviously interested. You heard Jane say there isn't enough that's necessarily relevant to the big companies. And the situation as I see it at the moment from the perspective of the UK outbound industry is that companies recognise that there's something that needs to be done. They're willing. Jane said the staff and the customers are interested, and it's just beginning really, but there isn't enough evidence really about precisely what could be done on the large scale, and that's where we're just starting really, and more research would be useful.
Okay, let's open it up a little bit broader than that to particularly the NGOs. Yep.
Thanks. My name is Neil Anandra. I'm with Conservation International, and I was really pleased to hear a lot of what we've been talking about here. And I just wanted to echo some of the issues and kind of give a picture of what we're looking at. CI is looking to decentralize pretty aggressively. We've already set up CBCs in Madagascar, the Andes, there's a new one coming in China. And one of the big issues is how do we handle tourism? And how do we do it in a decentralized way as opposed to through DC, which is the typical way we've dealt with it. The value chains are a big part of it, and we did one mainly around conservation and the environment in Ecuador, which I believe Sean has. It was published by USAID. We've got another one coming out from Madagascar, in which it was really interesting. We ended up playing the liaison between the companies and government through trying to find out what the intervention should be. The next big one is the tourism investment cycle, which was raised earlier. There's a planned meeting, I believe, with Oliver Hillel at the CBD for Brazil and possibly one for Mexico to look at a whole bunch of new development in brain freeze here. Sorry, jet lag. On the Mayan coast, where there's a whole bunch of new development coming in the state of Quintana Roo. And Oliver is trying to organize a meeting to try to influence how that development takes place. The other big area is, over the years, a lot of different organizations have developed good practices. We're now working with a number of US-based operators in terms of how do you actually implement those good practices. How do you write them into your contracts? What impact does that have with your partners? And how do your partners respond to what kind of support they need? This has really been limited to Central America and Ecuador and Galapagos. Basically because that's where we've got the funding, that's where we've got the focus. We are going to be extending that this coming year to Madagascar, which is why we did this analysis first. So I was really pleased to hear about the corporate interest, and if there's a way of expanding it on this side of the Atlantic, it would be great. In some ways, we've already started it with responsible travel, with an online database of CBTs globally, which go through a pre-screening to meet a standard that they have identified, which we help them feed properties into and facilities into. And we'll talk about that when we do our little presentation. Those are the main things. Thanks.
Okay. Anybody else from the non-governmental charitable sector, campaigning groups, and so on? this afternoon, but this is about bringing examples of good practice, good experience onto the floor.
I think another example of good practice to actually identify very specifically how tourism affects the poor is the introduction of labour audits within hotels. We've had some reference here to hotels employing poor people, but they might be employing them at levels which actually keeps them in poverty rather than lifting them out of poverty. Not only might they be paying them so badly that they're keeping them in poverty, but they might also be denying them some very basic rights which we would assume would be needed. And I think that the employment audit which was developed at Tourism Concern, for example, would be an example of good practice to actually get a bit more depth to this employment of poor people and what kind of employment they're having.
Last year we did a study of 40 UK and Dutch tour operators looking at sustainable supply development. In particular, what we're looking at there is how are the companies helping their suppliers to become more sustainable rather than just simply expecting them to be sustainable or not bothering about it. And the study is available at the website of the International Centre for Responsible Tourism, for free downloading. And I think there is a lot of interesting work to be done, not only on sustainable supply chain management and looking at the supply chains and to which extent now companies are expecting the suppliers to be sustainable, but the way in which we take responsibility for helping those suppliers to achieve those standards.
Can you say anything about the conclusions of that study? It sounds like really interesting.
Well, I mean, again, this sector is changing a lot. So when we did this was the beginning of a project called Travel Life that was being put together by the Federation of Tour Operators and the Dutch Tour Operator Association. What we're trying to do was inform what the company should do. And what we found is that each one of these telephone interviews was meant to last 15 minutes, and in fact lasted about an hour each. And the tour operators took notes of what they could be doing differently. And what we also found is that many of those companies have changed practice and have become much more aware of other things that maybe they didn't realize they were doing and they were doing already. So they said, well, now you gave me an example. Yes, I do some of that. I do it here and there and in that other place. So it's a sector that's changing very quickly, I think. We did find big differences between what the mass tour operators and the specialist tour operators do. The other thing, of course, the tour operators that wanted to speak to us were the ones that thought had something to say. And very few of them were cornered and told, you have to talk to us regardless. So the results look relatively positive because of the companies that were selected. And there is a list of companies there that wanted to talk to us, and hopefully we'll be able to go further than that. For me, one of the problems that there is that companies themselves don't really know what the staff do. And at our centre, we've tried to put together a tool by which the responsible tourism officer in a tour operator can get to find out what the destination reps do. We've gone to many destinations, and since we're using First Choice as an example time and time again here, I was just in Sharm el-Sheikh a couple of weeks ago, and I realised that the reason why Jane and others are here, and the fact that we see them here all the time, is actually translated to what happens in destination. I interviewed 15 tour operators there. The only one that even understood the meaning of sustainability or responsibility was First Choice. The others looked fairly blank. Their destination staff there were doing incredibly good work. And so I don't have any shares, by the way. But what I mean is, they were one of the companies that when we did our supply development survey, they came out very well. And when I went out to Sharm el-Sheikh, which is not a place where there's a whole lot of good practice happening in sustainability, I saw that they were going out of their way to make some of the things happening. And while another one of the companies had built a light and sound Bedouin tent that seats 500 people, who happens to be a competitor of theirs, they have decided to go every day of the week to a different locally owned Bedouin tent, where it's only Bedouins that work there, where they're using local produce, where they're selling real Bedouin tea, not PG tips, and they're just making sure that the money stays locally. And they've seen a commercial opportunity in that, but also a moral imperative.
That's really interesting.